Hello, everybody. I'm Dave Lee with International Podcast Day. Thank you for coming along and celebrating with us this year. I am very happy to announce that Annemarie Cross is going to be joining us this hour to talk about interviewing with purpose, how to conduct better podcast interviews. Annemarie, welcome to International Podcast Day. How are you?
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm great and glad to be back again.
Absolutely. If you guys don't follow Anne-Marie Cross, you need to. She provides plenty of insight and knowledge within the podcasting space. So before we get to that, I did want to thank our 2018 Podcast Day sponsors. Head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors to get a little bit more detail. But our platinum sponsor, 3 years running, Blueberry. They're a full-service podcasting company providing podcast hosting, stats, advertising opportunities. You can find more at blueberry.com. And thank you to our silver sponsors, repurpose.io automatically converts your audio podcast into engaging videos and uploads them to YouTube and other social media channels. You can try Repurpose for free. Head over to repurpose.io/IPD to start today. And of course, podcastsuccessacademy.com. This is a resource packed community offering tools, workshops, tutorials, courses, and so much more to teach you some skills that no one told you needed to succeed as a podcaster. Head over to podcastsuccessacademy.com to gain your free access today. Well, Anne-Marie, I know there are several people in the podcasting space that want to learn how to conduct better interviews. Sometimes it's a struggle, sometimes the conversation gets awkward, and we're looking forward to you sharing some of the things you've learned over the number of years you've been podcasting. So thank you and welcome to International Podcast Day.
Thank you very much. And as I mentioned before we went on the call, I hope that I'm able to provide incredible value for everyone. So let's dive in. I know as podcasters and interviewers, we always hope that we're going to capture a great story and weave our content alongside those that are adding to the conversation. But every now and again, it happens where we get a difficult guest where you just don't feel that you are on point and you think, goodness, can I really publish this piece of content? And I know if I look back over the 10 years, there have been many podcasts that I've thought, oh, can I really share this? And for some of them, they didn't come to air. So over the last 10 years, what I've done is I put together some techniques, some tools, and some systems that have really helped me. And I want to share what I've done so that you can incorporate some of these things in what you're doing. Maybe you're already doing these things, and that's a great big tick. That great, got that covered. Now, my background is in personal branding and communication. So some of the things that I'll be sharing today are around the psychology of communication, because with a podcast, we are communicating. And one of the things we don't have, unless, of course, you're streaming live, which is what we do often with our podcast, we don't have that visual element. So it's very much auditory. And there's some things that you can do and start to do and maybe not do so much that will enhance the conversation, enhance the level of engagement that you have with your audience. Now, I love the quote by Steve Jobs, and he said the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, the values, and the agenda of an entire generation that is to come. Now, if we were to take a step back for a moment, each and every one of us is a storyteller. Yes, we bring other people into the conversation through the platform that we are building, but we ultimately are the person who weaves the conversation together. And one of the things that I was taught many years ago when I reached out and got a mentor to help me in better communicating, better creating the nuances that I knew my ideal clients or my audience members would appreciate. One of the things that I was told was they come for the content, they stay for the host. So that means that you've got opportunities to build know, like, and trust as a host with every new person that happens to stumble across your podcast, because the topic you are speaking about has attracted them, has engaged with them because it's something that they're struggling with. But what we do as part of that conversation and the environment we create on our podcast, even with our guest, is going to determine whether the guest reaches out to you or whether there's a potential JV opportunity, lots of opportunities from our guests, but also for the listener's point of view. Are they going to come back? Because after that interview, the content has been shared and that's been great, but there's something about you that listener resonates with and thinks, you know what, I'm going to come back and listen to another show. So, the first thing I want to talk about today is setting the stage. Some of the things that I do to help prepare, because some of the things that happen down the track, the difficult guests, the guests that talk too much versus the guests that talk too little, and you think, oh my goodness, I have a whole 29 minutes to go, right through to someone who is self promoting all the time. A lot of that does not necessarily need to happen if you prepare beforehand. And I do a lot of preparation at the front end to save a lot of heartache and a lot of editing at the back end. So I want to share that with you today. I want to also talk to you about what I call the secret formula. It's not something that I created, but rather something that I learned many years ago when I started to get out on stage and start to speak. And it was something that I've used to model all of my podcast shows on. Every single presentation I actually model on this 4-step secret model formula that I want to share with you. I want to share with you some of the systems and the processes that I use, that I talk about earlier, that saves me a lot of heartache in the back end. And then I'm going to talk about the interviewing, managing your guests and the flow of information. Now, you might be thinking, I want to hear about some of the tools, some of the techniques that you use to manage the guest. Hopefully, you won't have as many difficult guests once you follow the process and the systems that I have in place, so that the conversation does flow and you don't need to go into control. So let's back up a little bit and talk about setting the stage. Some of the things that we need to be mindful of is that we have to manage and steer the conversation in a way that's relevant to your audience, relevant to the topic and theme that you're talking about. And this is for your overall podcast in general, as well as the specific topic on that show. So we've got the podcast as a whole, and then the episode, that show. And sometimes you might have a guest that is very overbearing and quite controlling, or they have their own agenda. And if you're not really clear on the consistency around branding, and I always go back to branding, every single piece of content, every tweet, every podcast episode, every conversation, how you introduce the guest, your outro, music, everything, sound effects, all impact and create a brand experience on your podcast. And if you're not doing that with intention, if you don't know, if you have not defined that, then it's very easy for a guest with a very strong personality, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you haven't set that stage and deliberately creating that in every single podcast episode and overall in your podcast, it's very difficult for listeners to describe in a few words who you are, what you stand for, and what they're going to get from every single one of your podcasts. People talk about you whether you know it or not. And so what you're creating as far as your brand, as far as your podcast is concerned, people will start to create and assume their own perspective if we have not set that stage and do that consistently. So show theme, show brand. Consistency is everything. And as a storyteller, what we need to do is we need to have a number of roles as part of that storyteller. We need to weave in various elements of the conversation so that it flows. And if we don't flow and we're jumping and going backwards and forwards, and then we're doing a backtrack and then a backtrack of a backtrack, by the time the audience has gone 5 minutes in, they're thinking that this is so confusing and overwhelming. Guess what? Stop, and then they're off to the next podcast. So we need a structure and a format. And I'm going to share with you on that secret 4-step formula in a moment about what a really good formula is. And so we need to also weave in our own personality and our own mannerisms and style, because that is something that you're going to bring to the podcast each and every time. And the beautiful thing about that is you might be talking about the exact same topic as 10 other podcast hosts because it's a really hot topic. But your journey, your experience, your heartaches, your failures, your successes, all of that woven in together as to who you are, your mannerisms and characteristics, the quirky sense of personality. And for some of you, you're trying to hide this, but I encourage you to bring that forward, because that's what's going to make you different from everyone else. And it's going to really impact the experience you create on your podcast. So if you are someone who's naturally humorous, be humorous, do it with intention. Use that to weave your podcast together, and your guests will know to expect that. So really important as that storyteller. Who are you as that storyteller? And make sure that you weave the conversation together in a flow, bringing in your own nuances, your own little snippets of information to add value to that conversation. One of the things that I do intentionally, and this is what I want to talk about now, is the things I do, and mindset is everything. is a couple of things. Be curious. You need to be curious, because if you don't have a curious perspective, then you don't dive deep into or listening out for something that guest says, which may just pass over. But you think, I want to dive deeper into that. Let's just back up a minute here before you move on. Great golden nuggets, but I want to find out more. What do you mean by that? And then that can create a whole flavor of conversation, which the guest may not have covered before, but is very relevant to your audience. So be curious. We don't need to know everything. When I started podcasting back in 2008, I was really fortunate because I had a co-host who had done some training in radio, and he was quite efficient in the way managing the call, and I was able to take a back seat. And if I still go back and listen to some of those old shows on Blog Talk Radio, I often cringe. But the reason I was cringing was because I thought, I don't know enough about that topic to really be able to talk into that. But as a storyteller, as a host, you don't necessarily need to know everything, because why would you invite guests on the show? But what you do need to know is to be able to know when to jump in, to stop the guest, to dive a little bit deeper, how to weave various, topics of each show together in an overall show that flows. And those are the things that we need to do. So be curious. Trust that you can do this. You don't need to do everything, and be yourself, as I mentioned earlier. Be yourself. For me, one of the things that I love to do is to create a platform where my guest can shine. I don't necessarily need to have any, contribution to the show. And I think some podcast hosts, you can kind of almost see that they're battling with the guest. Into, well, I know a little bit more about that, or I challenge that. Now, unless you are someone who is a host with intention that is there to challenge and be quite controversial, then go ahead and do that. That's on brand. That's very much you. But I've listened to a few shows where it's like, oh, there's something funny going on here, the nuances between the relationships being built. So for me, I just go with a mindset of curiosity, want to create an environment as if I was sitting across the table from someone, having a cup of coffee and having a chat with a friend I have yet to meet, and just asking questions and laughing. I mean, fun is one of my core values. And if it's not fun, then why would we do it? And sometimes the guests at the beginning of the show, they're quite nervous. And I just go in there and set that stage with intention. Again, it's with intention that this is going to be fun. The conversation that I have is such that eliminates any nervousness or anxiousness from the guest, so that they can speak with authority in a topic that I know that they know, and they bring that forward. And what will often happen at the end of 20 or 30 minutes, I'll say, well, that's a wrap. And they go, really? I could speak all day on this. And that, I think, is my my goal as the host, my role as that storyteller, to create an environment where people can share their information. So let's talk about the secret formula, the 4-step. This is what I promised to share with you. So we all know that they're adult learners. There's a couple of things about them that we need to know. They need buy-in, and that what's in it for them. The WIIFM concept, very, very important. I'm looking at some slides here because I use the same principle when I'm sharing information to my clients who want to get out on stage to speak. You can use the same principle for this as well, even if you're giving a short presentation. And you can use it in a podcast episode too. So here's some things we need to know about adult learners. They need buy-in. They also need that what's in it for them concept. They're generally skeptical. As adults, we are. If someone says something to us, we kind of do an internal check and think, how does that fit with what I know? And if it goes against our paradigm or our understanding of something, we're more open to going, you know what, I don't really know if I agree with that. We've got boundaries. We are judgmental. There's this thought process, this analytical process. They need decisiveness, and they need structure, and they need teaching and information for right now. This is generally speaking, of course, but just things you need to consider. And they need to have this in place even in your podcast. Now, there are unique learning styles and unique communication styles. And we know as adults, and I'm sure you know already, but I want to mention it again because it's leading up into the 4 key areas that I want to share today. People perceive information differently. They process information differently. And our unique learning style, it's derived by a combination of our own perception and processing techniques. Now, believe it or not, I'm more a visual person, But I love podcasting, and I love podcast or listening to audios now, because I find as a visual learner, if I'm watching someone, I'm distracted because I'm looking at what's going on in the background, and look at that microphone that they've got there. Look at her earrings. All of those things are quite distracting. So for me, I know that if I really want to listen to the information, I will minimize the screen if I'm looking at a video often, and I'll just listen to the audio. And because I've had decades of experience coaching and consulting over the phone and on Skype, and we didn't have tools and technologies like Zoom with video now that we have today, I became quite affluent in my auditory capacity, being able to hear the story behind the story if someone said something in that voice. And I think when we realize that, we realize the power that we have in our voices. We're sharing those stories. So let's look at these 4 different learning styles. Now, none of these learning styles, one is better than the other. They are all unique and they are all relevant, and the same for each person. So someone might be one certain learner and another a certain learner. And it doesn't mean one person is going to learn more than the other. So no comparison, and no one is better than the other. So what this enables you to do, so for those people who like to know, well, why should I do this? What benefit does it have if I use these 4 steps in the formatting of my podcast? Good question. Here is what they'll do. It's going to connect and engage with each person, no matter what learning style that they are in or what learning preference that they have. It enables you to deepen that relationship and a learning experience with each person. Because what happens is, as you share information in the right way and in the right process, it triggers the left and right brain. And that's what we do when we learn. It's a processing technique as we're learning and hearing this information. And when you connect and deepen your relationship with people, they're going to be able to likely remember you, but also the experience that you created long after the content has finished. They're going to remember the experience that you created, and they're more likely to want to reach out to you and start to work with you. So the origins of the secret formula, for those of you who like to know a little bit of the facts and some of the statistics and so forth, it was modeled after a format system developed by Bernice McCarthy, and she's the author of Format and Action: Creative Lesson Plans for Teaching to Learning Styles with Right and Left Techniques. And the secret formula is why, what, how, and what if. If you do nothing but know these or learn these and take these away, it has been a good learning for you from this presentation. Those are the 4 key steps that I use for every single training and how I format my entire podcast show. And let me just dive into each of those a little bit, give you a bit of a background on what each of those why, what, how, and what if is. The why is specifically talking to innovative learners. They're the learners that are saying, well, why should I learn this? You want to capture their attention right at the beginning, because if you haven't, guess what? They've moved on. They've gone somewhere else where they're going to get that information. I am very much an innovative learner because it sits in with the visual aspect of things. We're quite quick, and typically we probably are the ones that listen to podcasts on double speeds and video on double speeds because people talk too slow, sadly, for us. We need to paint a picture for them. We need a bigger picture. What's involved? What are you going to learn and take away from this particular podcast episode? And they need to have meaning and purpose and a reason for learning. So we need to give that up front. And I'll share with you in a moment how I do that. Actually, I'll do that now so it makes sense. So what I do when I structure my show right at the beginning, that's what I might do. I might say something. Are you struggling with learning how LinkedIn can optimize your social media, or do you want to get in front of key journalists and have been struggling on LinkedIn? Is that something you're trying to do? So you're tapping into the problem. I mean, that was horrendous. If I spent a bit of time on that, I'd come up with a better headline. But that's something that I might lead with a show. Are you an ambitious entrepreneur who wants to leverage LinkedIn to get out in front of the 96% of journalists who are there searching for experts? Well, stick around because my guest today is going to show you how. That, if someone is struggling with that and they want that information, don't know about you, but I think I'll be sticking around because I want to know more. So that's tapping into that why. Right at the beginning, paint that picture. The next step I mentioned is the what. And this is specific to analytical learners. They want to know what it is. So some of the things that you want to share with them, interesting facts. Where did it come from? Who created it? What is it really used for? Statistics. things like that, because they want to deepen their understanding and have it be that it's founded on relevant, studies, and it's not just some pie in the sky that someone has just, picked out of the thin air somewhere. So what I then tend to do is qualify or validate some information about my guests. Joining me today is so and so. He's an award winning, so sometimes award can be beneficial in this specific aspect. It can be number of years. It can be where they have been, where they are, if they're a host or an expert on a particular site, that works really well. So validating information about my guests so that the analytical learners go, oh, okay, so that particular guest, there's some creds on the street there. I think I'll listen to that. So again, you just dive in a little bit more into the what. Then the how. This is the bulk of the interview. This is where we really dive into some of the key steps, the 3 key points. And what I do at the beginning of the introduction, I will actually, and this is what I prepare before I even record the interview, because I record the interview from woe to go. So my guest is there while I do all of this introduction. And the reason I do that is because a number of guests have said, whilst they've listened, they're on fire. I actually mix in the music. I know a lot of you don't. That's okay. But I also have my music there. And for me, it has to be fun. It has to be upbeat. So by the time that I finish my intro, my guests are bopping in their seats. And it's like, oh, okay, I have to go and share my knowledge now. But I do that for a reason, because I want my guests to be pumped. And I share the 3 key things. And this is what Bob is going to share. Number 1. Number 2, number 3, let's dive in. And so people know as they're listening, these are the 3 key things that, we're going to walk away with today. And then I use those three key things to structure the show. So I hope that makes sense. That's how I sort of use that. And then that's the how. We dive into the first point and say, Bob, one of the things that you say is blah, 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 blah. Let's dive in. What are these 3 things that we are not doing wrong? Oh, right. And then we'll dive into that and we'll pull that apart. But the how speaks to common sense learners, getting back to that formula, the common sense learners who are asking, how does it work? So you want to explain, you want to dive deep. This is where you ask these really good questions. You dive in deep, you've set the stage. Now we can give them a hands-on demonstration in an audio format, of course. But you're helping people to understand how it works, and whatever it is, the topic that you're talking about, because people want to know. And case studies are really good. Statistics are really good. You can dive into that, and how-tos are really good as well. So you spend the bulk of the conversation on the how. Then the what if, this is for dynamic learners. So these are for the learners that have listened to the show and they're thinking, okay, what else? Where else can I apply it? And this is a really good place where you can ask the guest to share the next step, the call to action. And where else is this applicable or important? So you're giving them a bit of an overview as well. You've dived deep into the topic and pulled that apart, but you're also sharing with them other aspects that they can use. What else do they need to know? Because these guys are action oriented. They want to get into action. Now, using this 4-step formula is fantastic for developing, each particular episode. But it's also good if you are so on brand, and the guests that you share and bring on your show adds real value and credibility also to an area, I would assume, if you're using your podcast to build your influence and become that influential thought leader in your industry. It also speaks into what you can support as well. So if you've provided a really enticing, educational, engaging content in your episode, you can also encourage people to reach out to you with, whatever you've created in your call to action. Because people who have just listened and it's been so valuable, that content, they're going to want to, they'll be asking, what next? What next? Where can I learn a little bit more? So this is a really great opportunity for you to share that call to action too. There's some specific formulas and length of time, but I won't dive into that because I don't want to really overwhelm you with too much of the formula. But really, again, if you spend a lot of more content or time on the how to really dive in, but you have to have that why. What's in it for me? If you have not captured the innovative learners at the beginning, you've lost them already. Then if you've got bringing along those innovative learners, if you have not tapped into the analytical learners with information, this is going to be very difficult for you to bring along those analytical learners into the next stage, which is the common sense learners. How does it work? And then once you've got everybody on board, listen to the podcast Diving Deep, then of course you've got to tap into the dynamic learners, which is the what if, that everybody is listening. And when you've got an on-brand, on-topic podcast, you know that your ideal client, your ideal JV partner, alliance partner, referral partner are listening, and you're continuing to build that know, like, and trust with that relevant content. So I hope that was helpful. This is probably something that I spend a lot of time on with my clients. So this is really just scratching the surface, but hopefully you'll be able to look at what you're doing and just incorporate one thing at a time. Don't try and do everything. Maybe just talk about thinking about, my introduction. Can I do that? Incorporating the why. Can I ask a statement or say something, a question that speaks specifically into a problem that my listeners are struggling with, and then introduce my guest, then the key points that we're going to talk about, and allow the conversation to flow that way. So I hope that was helpful for you. The next thing I want to talk about is systems and processes. Now, I remember back in 2008, my co-host would often do a lot of the planning and prepping for the guest, and he would spend hours researching on the web, the different resources that my guests would send, or our guests would send. And I was thinking, we only did that show. Well, we did that show for 2 years, and then I've had a podcast ever since on my own, and some co-hosted ones as well. But I thought there's just no way that I could spend so much time researching guests. And I've started at the beginning of this year, because I'm a bit of a, I just love meeting lots of people. I started a daily podcast, and I've got my own 3, and then I host and produce for clients and alliance partners too. And there's just no way that I can spend hours researching guests. Even though I'd love to, I can get stuck in analysis paralysis too if I let myself. So what I did was decided, I need specific information that will allow me to put together some show notes, that will allow me to follow along to keep me on focus. Because, if you're geeking out about a new piece of technology or whatever, I can speak for hours about that, picking someone's brain, and we, brainstorming, fantastic. But is it really relevant to my guests? Maybe not, maybe more so for me. So I needed something to really help keep me focused, but allowed me to prepare with as minimal time as possible. And one of my mentors has always says, systems liberate you. So systems and processes that I got into place were a guest profile. And with that guest profile, it's all the contact details, obviously information from my guest. I also have an opportunity where they will provide for me the 3 key points that are benefit driven, that are outcome focused. And I give some examples in the guest profile so that it helps them word it up. Every now and again, we might tweak something, but thankfully now the guests have really got clear on the kind of statements that I use. And I just copy and paste. Well, now one of my team members does that, copies and pastes onto the show notes so that I can read that in the introduction. So that's what that guest profile has. The guest profile also has an area where if they are stating some statistics or some relevant information that's pertinent to the conversation that's going on, I'll ask them to share some links that can validate what they're thinking or what they're saying. And the reason I did that is because one of our listeners reached out to me and said, oh, where did that guest get that information from? And I was thinking, I really don't know. And you want to make sure that what you're sharing on your platform has some relevance, has some study behind it, whether they've, the guests themselves have conducted studies, or whether there's some, validating information. And I'll include those on the show notes as well if people want to know further. That just helps prepare. There's other things that I also help them prepare as well. What we like to do is with every show is create quote graphics. And I used to go through those myself and highlight some of the things that the guest has said, but I realized I don't have enough time to do that. So what I get the guest to do is to think about, some of the things that they will often say, because it's pertinent very much to what they're sharing on the show. And again, this all relates to delivering a better interview because you are prepared and your guest is prepared as well. And how you feel when you are in the interview how you feel, your confidence, whether you feel prepared, is going to really help you come across and build again, the confidence of your guest as well. So this is all relevant. So I get them to share, write little quotes, and we'll create those into quotes, which we then feed back all over our social platform and funnel people back to the original show. So those are just some of the things that we do on our guest profile. You might have something as well. I know over the last probably month or so, I've probably done more interviews now than I have previously, because just some of my colleagues have reached out and said, we want to get you on our shows. And I've noticed the way that they're compiling information. And look, it's all right, but I think if they started to increase the amount of interviews that they were doing, it would be difficult, because there's a lot of information that they're not getting and just kind of going with the flow, which is all right if that's the kind of person you are. I like to be a little bit more structured and kind of know what I'm aiming for and setting that intention. So it's interviewing with purpose. I know exactly the kind of information I want to capture. Something else that I do as well, and this is where you're really preparing the guest, I have a sound tips sheet. Now, admittingly, some guests don't read that sound tips, especially the one that says, try and get a microphone plugged in so that we can hear you on the microphone and not your internal mic. And there I sit opposite a guest who's relying on their internal mic on their computer, and the sound is horrendous. But more often than not, they are prepared. And some of the things that I share with them in that is that we want to make sure that you sound the best, you give the value, and that the audience really wants to find out more. And these are some of the tips that I've learned that will allow you to do that. And then I give some tips like keep your answers short and sweet and concise. And some of the things to do and not do. Again, helping the guest prepare. What else do? I also have that all organized now. We now have a one-page web page that is dedicated to each and every podcast that we host. And all of the information is there. So if I'm speaking to a potential guest and I think this would be a great guest, I send them a link and all the content is there. The guest profile is there, a bit of information about who I am and about the show. The guest profile's there, the sound tips there, my online calendar is there, which continues to update, as well as some shows previously so people can go and listen and watch, because I stream live as well when we record. That's all on that one page. So it just helps the guest prepare and understand who I am, the structure and kind of the nuance of the show, the experience that I like to create, so that when they are in front of me, recording their interview, they know what to expect. And they know that there's going to be laughter and all those different things. And so if I compare that to what I was doing when I wasn't preparing, in the 2 years from 2008 to 2010, we weren't doing that. That's probably why I was not as confident, because I didn't have that structure and I knew exactly what the next step was. So hopefully that's helpful. So systems and processes, is there something that you can do if you don't have anything in place, like a guest profile? Really guiding the guest as to what information that you require, and even give a bit of a blurb of the type of experience that you want to create with your show and how they can contribute. Sometimes I think guests don't know what to expect because we don't actually tell them what to expect. And again, this is what I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this presentation. What is going to set you apart from every other podcast host and other podcasts talking about the same topic is the experience that you create, and you are very much part of that, and how you structure your show is very much part of that as well. All right, let's have a look at some other things that I want to talk to you about. Oh yes, managing the guest and the flow of information. Let's dive into some of those things. So hopefully, as I mentioned earlier, the preparation that you've done beforehand and the information you've sent to your guest has helped them to understand exactly what to expect and what not to expect. Now, sometimes you've got a guest who talks way, way too much. And I remember the first year that we started interviewing, my co-host and we asked the guest at the top of the show, and it was only a half-hour show, how are you? And tell us a bit more about yourself. Well, open-ended questions like that are a big no-no, because seriously, I think 15 or 20 minutes later, she was still going on about how wonderful she was. And she was very impressive, but I was thinking, oh my goodness, we didn't even need to be here. We could have just gone, okay, it's over to you. Floor is yours. And we were then too polite to dive in, and we didn't have some of these strategies, and we were Skyping one another, my co-host and I, going, you jump in, interrupt her, and he was saying, no, you do it. And it was, anyway, finally she took a breath, and I think he jumped in and said, that's really great, let's just have a couple of questions here that I know our listeners would find valuable if you provide some information to. So that is something that you don't want to do, ask open-ended questions. But here, if a guest does talk too much, you can use a technique, and I've heard this before, even in conversation with someone, is you say their name, and you might say Bob, and if Bob continues to talk, I don't know why I'm using the word Bob. Sorry if there are any Bobs who are listening to. Nothing against you. You probably talk well and know how to deliver an interview or even conduct an interview. But say Bob was talking, like you say Bob, and if he continues to talk, you go, Bob, just let me jump in here for a moment. And hopefully then Bob will talk. Otherwise, or stop talking. Otherwise, you just continue and kind of with a level of authoritative confidence, just continue to speak. And then that person, Bob, will stop. And that will allow you to say something like, you've got so much information there, a lot of different points. I want to just take a step back and pull some of those apart, because I know that this is going to provide incredible value for everyone listening today. Bob, let's go back to the first point and then guide them to that. So strategy is to use his name to interrupt. Something else that I have often used as well is just to say, hey, that's fabulous. I just talk over in my approach. Sometimes using humor as well. I don't want to offend anyone by jumping in and just, kind of stopping them, because here's the thing. I think you want to monitor the conversation, and you get to a point where you realize that a natural stop and chunking down of that conversation is going to be relevant, because this person has just droned on and on. I remember one of my mentors told me once, and she was from the radio background, said one of their techniques was not to let the guest speak for longer than 90 seconds. So just monitor that. But I realized that sometimes there was a piece of or a topic or piece of content that my guest was sharing, which was really quite deep. And the way in which my guest was sharing was great. That, the tone of the voice, the speed, all of that was interesting. And so what I'll do sometimes is I'll close my eyes, because obviously I can't do that now so much because I'm watching and I'm streaming live. But sometimes if you just listen in, you can kind of get that sense of the conversation is flowing. So I will not interrupt in that instance, even if it goes over 90 seconds. But sometimes the guest is kind of waffling, and you've got to jump in there. It's like you don't want to have that ship sink if you can kind of see that it's sinking. So jump in there with the paddle and go, Bob, let's just stop for a moment there. There's so many good points. And again, so use that for someone who talks too much. Talking too little can be really difficult, and that's probably one where I tend to struggle a little bit too. And then I think, oh my goodness, how am I going to fill a whole, kind of 30 minutes if the guest is giving really short, or they're so nervous. And I remember someone that if I think back to a time where, I think it was this last year, was talking to someone who had a great story, but I could see right at the beginning he was really nervous. And sometimes it's all about setting the stage and getting them into their flow. And so this is where the prep works really well. If I can see that a guest is really struggling, I'll pull up some of those notes, and I'll actually then lead them back. And I'll say, look, I'll use someone else's name, Tracy. Let's say Tracy. So Tracy, as I'm looking through your notes, is something that really stood out. And I wanted to just share this because I think it's so unique. And then go back to something that's relevant to them, their own story. Because I think sometimes as a guest, and if we put our own, if we put the hat on of a guest, sometimes we are nervous. We just need to break the ice a little bit. And what piece of content do we know so well that will often allow the anxiousness and nerves to go away? And that's our own story. So sometimes by just tapping into that and then pulling it apart, and of course you as the storyteller needs to weave that into why it's relevant, pre-framing your content is really important. But that allows the guest to get rid of some of those nerves. But as the host and as the storyteller, you need to make it, relevant to the story. So that's what I might sometimes do. If I do ask an open-ended question, tell us how you got into this. The reason I'm asking you this is because I know that there are many people who are watching today who will want to go from corporate career into entrepreneurial career. And I know your story is quite unique. And so floor is yours, and then I'll allow them to share that. But I pre-frame that, and that allows the audience to go, okay, there's relevance there. This is going to be helpful for me too. And so again, maybe break the ice, spend a little bit of time in their story to hopefully get the host in a place where they're not so nervous. So that's for the guest who talks too little. Now, of course, remember too that many of you as podcasters, you're pre-recording, so you can edit out some of these awkward pauses and awkward silence. But of course, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're as efficient and proficient as possible. So if we eliminate that post-production time, you can spend way more time in having the conversations from the potential clients who are hearing your podcast and thinking, I want to work with that person. Now, what about the person who self-promotes too much? Well, there is a fantastic button called mute. No, seriously. I had someone actually that I'm going to interview, and the wife came up to me, it was her husband, said, he does tend to talk a lot. I go, that's okay. I've got a mute button and I can use that. In that instance, hopefully you would have shown in the sound tips that you send your guest, you have absolute opportunity to share how people can find out more about you. We'll do that at the end. And I actually say the content that you provide leading up to that is going to have everyone race over to your website, or maybe not. So, dive in, provide value, let us experience your expertise, and then I'll give you absolute time to be able to share that. So my guests know that they don't have to kind of get every opportunity to weave that in. But if they continue to do that, that would be, and thankfully it hasn't happened so much, but I would stop them and say, Bob, I'm going to give you absolute opportunity to share more about the book and how to get a hold of that. But for now, let's just dive into that. And that would probably be a section that I would cut out or get one of my team to cut out. But here's the thing, you train people on how to treat you. And so if you're not upfront in your sound, tips, or if you're not right up front and you pull that up and hope that this person is going to stop, then you're kind of giving them permission. So as the host, this is your show. As a podcaster, and I'm sure many of you have been at it for years, what it takes, the amount of energy and time and commitment to build a level of rapport and know, like, and trust with your audience. So it's just like if you had a room of guests or of your guests or people who you really respected and who respected you, and you invited them all to the hall, and all of a sudden this person got up, took the microphone and completely blurted nothing but pushing sales, 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 you would not allow that person to remain on stage. You would, politely go, you know what? Let's just turn that mic off. So same with your podcast episode. Don't let someone take that over. You train people on how to treat you and what to expect on your podcast as well. So stand firm in that as well. So if that's someone who is far too self-promoting. And sometimes there are guests which you get to the end of the show and you think, my goodness, tried everything I could. But anyway, next time is a next show. So what I want to do also too is share with you a couple of conversation starters. And I've actually created a list. And because I sat down one day and I thought, what do I say in that instance? And a whole lot just kind of came out. Over 10 years, you do develop quite a few different techniques. And so I've created a bonus cheat sheet, and I'll give you a link on how you can get access to this. But it's open-ended conversation starters, what to say when you don't know what to say to avoid that awkward silence. So here are just a couple. Let's have a look at some of my go-tos. So I'll often say here, number 2, tell me more about that. That's really interesting. Tell me more about that. And sometimes, if you listen to some of my interviews, there are times, even today, when I say today, not like today, but there are times through my interviews, I lose my train of thought and I just start speaking. And I trust that I know that what comes out of here, once it goes from here to there, it will have some semblance of yeah, of interest, but I don't know where this conversation is going. And you know what, just go with the flow, just trust that you know what you're talking about, because it's your show and you've been doing this, I'm sure, for a while. So tell me more about that. Why is that, do you think? Why is this something you're so passionate about? That can really, again, right at the beginning, open up that possibility for guests to get rid of their anxiousness. Let's dive deeper into this topic, because I think many people struggle with this. Why is this? Describe this for me. Interesting. I've heard that before, but why do you believe this is to be true? Why are you speaking into this? And what are some unique ways that no one else has spoken about before that you want to share on the show? So again, you have a couple of just kind of go-to things, but if you download this particular cheat sheet, you're going to be able to have those in front of you. But sometimes just one word or two words. How so? How so? And then just stop. Something that else I do, and I haven't mentioned to you, is I'll often have a notepad next to me, because sometimes in the conversation you don't want to interrupt the guest and they might be sharing a couple of key points. Now, as a storyteller, you're of course knowing where the story is going, but you want to also be there right in the midst of the conversation so that you can manage that. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but we're listening to people share their content, you think, this is fantastic, I need to be taking notes for myself. But as a storyteller, you want to be managing that call. So what I do is I'll write down some notes just in the the sequential format that they've provided. So I will then stop the guest after they breathe, they take a breath, and I'll say, look, these are some great points. I want to pull those apart. I want to dive deeper into each of those. So let's go back to the first one. And then I will allow the guest to dive a little bit deeper into it. And then I'll say, now the second point you mentioned was this and this. Can you share a little bit more about why this is so important? And so my guest will share a little bit more about that point. And then the third point, I'll say, now this is the last point you mentioned. Let's just touch on this too, because I think this is really important. Sometimes what I'll do, if the guest has provided, say, more than 3 points, say 5 points, what I'll do is I'll actually list them. I'll say point number one was this, number two was this, number three was this, now number four. And I'll do that intermittently in the conversation, because sometimes as listeners listeners, we forget what each of the previous foundations was. So I repeat that because I want my all of my audience to follow along and continue to build that knowledge. And sometimes someone might only come into the podcast, if they're fast forwarding, they might miss something, and you want to make sure that you've summarized. So those are just some techniques that I do as well, writing down those notes. And sometimes the guests may be a little bit all over the place. However, if you've got those 3 key points that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview on what the show is about and what the guest is going to share, that keeps them focused and it keeps you focused as well. There was a lot of conversation in here. So what I'm going to do is just go back. If you've got any specific questions, I think we've still got about 10 minutes or so before the next guest comes in here. Let me just go back here. Otherwise, just post 5 minutes. We've got 5 minutes. Let's dive in deep. I've been doing a little bit of lecturing. Hopefully it's been helpful for you and you've got some insights that you can share. There's no harm in stopping the conversation and helping guide the guest in the right direction. Absolutely. It certainly is. And you know what, Gabriella, I hope that's your name. I do that live as well. I just give myself permission to do that. Absolutely. Jules ask what any booking forms for guests. I use Calendly for my calendar. Absolutely. That is really good. Let me see what other questions. Yes, a scheduling tool for guests, please. Yeah, Calendly I use. Again, so what I have is we have that one web page. I just have a document that they download. It's just a Word document. If you wanted to, you could also create like a Google form or Google Drive, a form on Google Drive. One of the reasons that I tend not to do that is because I have a number of people who also touch that information. So I've got my guest coordinator, she creates the show notes, and then once the show goes live, I have someone else who schedules that on and pulls information from that content too. We may change down the track on just online, like on Google Drive form or form, but at the moment we just use Word. Let's see what other questions. that anyone has. Where can we see a sample of that one-page webpage? You know what? Let me just let me see if I can get one up. And to show you, I think I'm on a different computer. This is actually my podcasting computer. I have everything set up with my light and all that. Let's see if I can find this. Otherwise, if I can't, okay, here we go. So if you go to, actually, why don't I copy and paste now? Okay, now this is an actual page where I send people to. So hopefully I won't have an influx of guests. If you want to come on the show, just email me and share a little bit more about, you're welcome, share a little bit more about what you want to share, and would love to hang out with you and get you on the show. But that's pretty much, if you click through on that, it's a pretty basic page, but it has everything on it. You know, create something that's relevant for you, and then you can send all your guests. There's some of the comments that I get from guests, and some of the guests, my guests, have actually become clients. And I think, again, every single touch point that you create and how you manage guests, your responsiveness to guests, because you never know who that guest is or who that guest is connected to. And I often get a lot of comments about how appreciative our guests have been in how we managed their content and got their information from them. So how do I tell the guest if I'm not going to use the interview? That is really great. Okay, if there was a guest that, there would be two ways that I would do that. If the guest was over promotional, I would just say to them, look, and I would give them an opportunity to redo it with them, because that's just kind of what I would do. But I would give them some guidelines as to what my expectations were. Sometimes there's been an opportunity, or sorry, there's been a situation where the sound quality was just so bad that I'll say to them, look, we cannot use that. My team tried to edit that, but that's just something we can't use. So I'll give them an opportunity to redo that. Otherwise, what I would do, and I have done in the past, is I've edited out sections and chunks of conversation, which I think way too over promotional or droning on too long, and I've tightened that up, and that can make for a really good show too. And even if the show is, you know, maybe 30 minutes and you edit it down to a shorter amount of time, that's fine. Chunk it down, cut out the bits that you think, I just cannot use that. But if you can't use it, or in my instance, it would be because the sound was too bad, or I'd say to the guests, look, I'm sorry, you know, these are the reasons why we're not doing it. I haven't, you know, if you would like to redo it, but here are the things that I would have, you know, we would have to have in the interview if we were to use that. So I hope that helps. Just jump on in there, Dave, when you need to. I know that we've got a tight schedule to go through. Otherwise, I'll just continue to scroll and see if we've got questions here.
Yeah, thank you, Annemarie, so much for joining us. It was a fantastic broadcast. It was a really good opportunity to learn, and we can't thank you enough for sharing your message. So before we get out of here, where can people go to find out a little bit more about you, your podcast, and what you're doing in the podcasting space?
Sure. The best place to go, and I did promise to share with everyone on how they can get access to the that cheat sheet, and it is podcastingwithpurpose.com. And that's a great place to connect with me. But then podcastingwithpurpose.com/IWP mini training. So podcastingwithpurpose.com/IWP mini training. There's some other things that are in there too. There's a video on mindset, the key to success things. I touched on those a little bit today. Video 2, what kind of interviewer style are you? We touch on some of those things. And then how to handle 3 of the most difficult guests. There's some more things that I share in that as well as that cheat sheet with 31 conversation starters. If you want that, go there. And yeah, podcasting with purpose is kind of where I'm putting a lot of the content and what we're doing now. We're using podcasts to help Really, people monetizing the message. A lot of my clients are consultants and coaches, and they want to have a podcast, but not necessarily an ongoing one. So we're using a really unique podcast series to really help people have audio out there, but not necessarily an ongoing one, but pretty much being able to monetize that from the very first episode that they have. So that's all their podcastingwithpurpose.com.
Awesome. Well, from the International Podcast Day team, Anne-Marie, we thank you again for sharing your knowledge, and thank you again for joining the stream and representing yourself, your podcast, and of course Australia.
Fantastic and such a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Happy International Podcast Day, everybody.